The day had been a relentless surge of sound and desperate need. The dusty roads of Galilee had surrendered their heat to the cooling shadow of evening, but the intense warmth of human urgency lingered in the minds of the 12 men crowding the small fishing boat. They were seasoned fishermen, their hands thick with the residue of nets and ropes, but their hearts were now burdened by a different kind of labor. The overwhelming, unceasing demands of following the Messiah, coupled with the dizzying responsibility and confusion of his ministry. The teacher slept soundly on a cushion in the stern, a profound contrast to the restlessness that churned through his followers. Simon Peter gripped the tiller, the wood rough against his palm, yet his control was utterly illusory. He saw not the darkening water stretched before them, but the faces of those he had inadvertently slighted that day, the sharp words he had spoken in frustration when the crowds pressed in too closely, the constant, low thrum of insecurity about their uncertain future. Was this monumental journey sustainable? Were they truly chosen, or merely playing out a grand illusion? That noise of internal accusation, the unceasing loop of self-doubt, and the heavy weight of cumulative guilt was already louder and more insidious than any noise the external world could produce. Near the bow, the sons of Zebedee, James and John, watched the shoreline quickly fade into shadow. Their mutual silence was not the peace of contemplation. It was the heavy quiet of unspoken, feverish ambition. They harbored a corrosive desire for preeminence, a subtle, spiritual competition that made every shared moment feel like a test, and every kind word from their master a potential threat to their standing. That low-grade spiritual rivalry was a silent sickness, an internal tempest brewing, fueled by pride and possessiveness, long before the wind shifted direction. Even in the immediate physical presence of the source of all peace, they could not escape the inner violence of their own desires. The air grew perceptibly heavier, thick with the metallic scent of coming rain and the rapid pressure change characteristic of the region. The surface of the vast lake, which had moments before been smooth as polished obsidian, began instantly to ripple into sharp, black peaks. They recognized the signs instantly, the sudden, violent squalls for which the Sea of Galilee was infamous. Yet, even as the first true gust struck the sail like a devastating physical blow, their initial reaction was not purely the practiced fear of the water. It was the raw, paralyzing panic born of being spiritually overwhelmed, the horrifying realization that their practical skills were utterly insufficient against forces that exceeded mortal control. The small boat dipped sharply. Icy water surged over the gunwales, immediate and shocking. The men, who prided themselves on their absolute mastery of this treacherous environment, scrambled instinctively. Their lifelong training offered tactics for navigation, for bailing, and for survival, but it offered no effective antidote for the spiritual terror that now tightened their chests, a profound terror that perfectly mirrored the unresolved chaos deep within their souls. They had wholeheartedly believed they were sailing towards a future of triumphant glory, yet suddenly they were facing complete and total annihilation in the present moment, desperately clinging to the rails of a vessel rapidly filling with the turbulent sea. The central, desperate question hung unspoken in the torrential spray. Could the Holy Presence sleeping so profoundly among them truly extend his unparalleled power to the deepest, most inaccessible part of their being? The churning waters of guilt, the corrosive currents of hate, and the roaring, deafening winds of anxiety? They were about to learn that the Lord of creation was profoundly concerned not only with the devastating external storm threatening their mortal lives, but fundamentally and eternally, with the persistent, internal storm threatening their souls. They desperately needed a peace that radically transcended circumstance, a quiet, deep surrender that could only come from truly recognizing and submitting to absolute divine sovereignty. The wind howled a powerful challenge, demanding that they confront not only the immediate, towering waves, but the profound, humiliating lack of faith residing within their hearts. This terrifying journey across the water was, in truth, a crucial crossing into the uncharted, desperate territories of their own needy hearts. Part 2. Trials of Faith. The storm escalated with shocking speed, transforming the serene basin into a raging amphitheater of noise and spray. The boat became a fragile, tormented toy, tossed between abyssal troughs and impossible crests. The fishermen fought with the frantic, exhausting energy of desperation. They were professionals, men who had faced death on this water countless times. But this squall possessed a malevolent intensity that defied experience. Every fiber of their physical strength was deployed, bailing water, straining against the snapping ropes, trying to lower the sail, but the sea's violence swallowed their efforts whole. Their internal struggles magnified under the pressure of imminent death. Peter's usual confidence fractured into brittle, self-recriminating fear. His prior boasts of loyalty seemed hollow now. If he could not save their physical lives by his own strength, how could he possibly uphold the immense spiritual obligations he had promised? The doubt was a cold vice, tighter than the grip of the waves. He remembered the comforting stability of his old life, the predictable rhythm of net casting and selling, a world free from this high-stakes, terrifying ambiguity. The refusal of the call manifested not as a conscious turning away, but as an overwhelming desire to be returned to the simple, manageable past, where storms were merely physical phenomena, not spiritual crucibles. James and John, the ambitious brothers, found their rivalry momentarily suspended by shared, stark terror. Yet, even in their bailing efforts, an unspoken thought persisted. If they survived, surely their contribution to the boat's safety would earn them a higher place. Even panic could not fully extinguish the flame of selfish desire. They struggled against the physical elements, but the most profound struggle was the battle against the ego demanding recognition even in extremis. Exhaustion began to settle in, a heavy, paralyzing cloak. The absurdity of their predicament struck them with the force of a battering wave. The one man who possessed the power to command creation was asleep. They watched him, utterly undisturbed by the chaos that threatened to claim them all. This deep, divine repose became the meeting with the mentor, though not through a conversation, but through the profound, unsettling silence of his trust. His stillness was a rebuke to their anxiety, a silent instruction in perfect surrender. They had sought guidance in words and teachings, but now, the ultimate lesson was offered in his absolute, unwavering peace, resting entirely on the Father's providence. The boat groaned, timber protesting violently against the onslaught. Water filled the bilge quickly, turning their desperate efforts into futile gestures. They realized, with a sinking horror far greater than the vessel itself, that skill, effort, and earthly wisdom were worthless here. Their very survival demanded something beyond human capacity. It demanded the active intervention of the divine power residing in their midst. Driven by this desperate, final understanding, Peter stumbled toward the stern, propelled by a fear that had finally transcended self-pity and become a raw cry for salvation. The threshold was crossed. They abandoned their reliance on human strength and committed fully, irrevocably, to the necessity of miracle. Part 3. Divine Intervention. The moment Peter reached the stern, shouting over the tempest, the entire spiritual dynamic of the small vessel shifted. He did not ask for help with the ropes. He demanded a reason for the teacher's indifference, his voice thick with the accusation of abandonment. "Master, do you not care that we are perishing?" The raw, human doubt was laid bare, the fundamental spiritual struggle to reconcile God's perceived silence with human suffering. Jesus rose slowly, awakened not by the noise of the external gale, but by the deeper, more profound clamor of their fear and their lack of trust. His gaze swept over the desperate men, men skilled in navigation, yet utterly lost in the chaos of their own making. He looked past the raging waves to the terror etched on their faces, the exposed vulnerabilities of their inner lives laid bare by the crisis. He saw the guilt in Peter's eyes, the corrosive anxiety gripping the others, the foundational failure to believe that his presence guaranteed safety, regardless of the physical manifestation of danger. He addressed not the disciples, but the forces of nature itself. A simple command, delivered not with strain or urgency, but with the quiet authority of absolute dominion. "Peace, be still." The words were an emanation of divine will, an immediate imposition of order upon chaos. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The wind did not gradually abate, it ceased entirely. The roaring, foaming sea did not slowly subside. It became instantly smooth, like glass reflecting the moonless sky. The waves, which moments before had been poised to crash the life out of the boat, flattened into an unsettling, profound calm. The transition was so immediate, so unnatural, that the disciples were left stunned, drenched, and suspended in an unnerving silence. This was the divine intervention, the definitive proof of sovereignty. But the deeper intervention was internal. Jesus then turned his gaze back to the terrified man, and his words cut through the physical stillness and penetrated the residual turmoil in their souls. "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" The revelation was blinding. They had been afraid of dying in the water, but now they realized they should have been afraid of the one who commands the water. The true danger was not the storm. The true failure was the doubt that had persisted even while salvation slept beside them. This moment revealed the hidden truth. Anxiety was merely a symptom of profound disbelief in the ultimate power of their guide. The lesson was clear. If he commanded the wind, he also commanded the guilt, the hate, and the anxiety that tormented their inner landscape. The crossing the threshold was complete. They had moved from relying on their own strength to standing face to face with the terrifying, beautiful reality of God's unqualified power, a power that demanded total surrender of the soul. Part 4. The Test. The return journey, in the eerie, post-storm calm, became a silent test of their understanding. The disciples bailed the remaining water from the boat, working with subdued reverence. The profound shock of the miracle had stripped away their protective layers of arrogance and familiarity. The abrupt silence amplified the noise they had not dealt with, the relentless internal accusations and competitive thoughts. The physical challenge was over, but the spiritual test had just begun. Could they retain the peace bestowed upon them, or would the old anxieties immediately rush back to fill the void left by the external storm? Peter found himself immediately confronted by the ghost of his earlier panic. His fear had been exposed as a failure of faith, a profound humiliation. The test was the struggle to accept the revelation without letting shame dominate. His internal enemy was not the memory of the waves, but the relentless, internal judge who whispered that he was unworthy of the Master's trust. James and John felt the chilling weight of their ambition. They looked at each other, seeing the reflection of their naked, selfish desire for greatness. That desire, when viewed against the backdrop of Jesus' terrifying, simple authority, seemed petty and foolish. The external conflict had forced an alliance against nature, but now they faced the immediate possibility of renewed internal competition. Would they continue to scheme for prominence, or would they accept the humble reality that they were all equally dependent, equally unworthy, and equally loved? The boat glided silently toward the distant shore, and the disciples became intensely aware of the vast gulf between their own limited human perception and the infinite power residing beside them. They wrestled with the unsettling question, who is this man, that even the wind and the sea obey him? They had received the reward of safety, but the deeper reward, true inner peace, required absolute, unqualified acceptance of his identity. The presence of Jesus, now awake and quietly observant, demanded total transparency. Their old ways of coping, using skill, argument, or silence, were useless. They were left exposed to the scrutiny of perfect love. The anxiety they felt was the residual tension of holding onto their own control, their own perceived righteousness, even in the face of absolute grace. This quiet night was a laboratory for the soul, where they were being forced to confront the true sources of their inner storms, not external pressures, but internal resistance to divine perfection. The tests, allies, and enemies phase revealed their primary enemy was the entrenched, prideful independence of their own hearts. Part 5. The Revelation. As the boat finally scraped against the soft sand of the shore, a new day was beginning, but the disciples felt utterly transformed, as if they had navigated a lifetime in a single terrifying night. The immediate danger had passed, but the central spiritual ordeal now required them to fully process the implications of the miracle. The true revelation was not merely that Jesus controlled nature, but that he cared enough to expose their spiritual weakness and provide absolute rest for their souls. The greatest challenge was approaching the inmost cave, the deep core of their unresolved fears and guilt. Peter realized that his anxiety was rooted in a foundational misunderstanding of grace. He had believed that safety and peace were earned by effort, piety, or skill. The storm had proven that every single one of his efforts was ultimately meaningless without Christ. The physical rescue was merely a sign pointing to the greater rescue, the reconciliation of the soul from the self-imposed chaos of striving and judging. The quiet, shared moment on the shore became the critical turning point. They understood that the hatred and ambition that plagued James and John stemmed from the same root, a desperate need to establish self-worth through status and competition. When Jesus commanded the external world to be still, he was providing the blueprint for their internal lives. Cease the striving, halt the self-judgment, and surrender the control. Peace was not the absence of trouble, but the presence of Christ, dominating the chaos both outside and within. The climax of their spiritual ordeal was the recognition that the solution to their anxiety was not introspection or self-improvement, but total relinquishment. The reward, the seizing the sword, was the profound, unsettling stillness that settled upon their spirits. This was a stillness earned not by effort, but by revelation. They had witnessed the absolute authority that forgave all their failings, the failure of faith, the ambition, the panic, and commanded not only the sea, but the very depths of their guilty consciousness to be silent. The primary conflicts were resolved. The guilt was silenced by forgiveness, the ambition was dwarfed by sovereignty, and the anxiety was dissolved by trust. Part 6. The Aftermath. The days following the storm were marked by an altered understanding of their reality. The external world continued its relentless pace. Crowds followed, demands were constant, and the political landscape remained threatening, but the men were internally different. They had learned that the true vessel of their lives was not the wooden boat, but their faith itself, and the true pilot was always present. The road back was not geographical, but psychological and spiritual. They resumed their ministry, but with a new depth of understanding regarding their own frailty and the limitless supply of divine peace. When Peter felt the familiar, cold grip of doubt or guilt resurface, he now recalled the image of the sleeping master, perfectly at rest amid the chaos, and the powerful, simple command, "Peace, be still." He began to practice the surrender demonstrated by Jesus, consciously choosing to silence the self-condemnation by anchoring himself in the memory of the miracle. James and John, though still wrestling with their competitive natures, found the internal conflict less consuming. The storm had highlighted the absurdity of vying for a high place when every life depended entirely on a single word from their master. The weight of their ambition was lessened by the realization that true greatness lay in humility and service, not status. Their transformation was a slow growth, not a sudden cure, but the foundation was irrevocably changed. Their spiritual growth radiated outward. They approached the sick and the troubled not merely as followers, but as witnesses who had themselves been delivered from the ultimate internal storm. They understood that the greatest anxiety often stemmed from the fear of being abandoned or judged, and they now carried the conviction that in the presence of the Messiah, neither abandonment nor ultimate judgment was possible. Their faith was no longer theoretical or conditional. It had been tested in the darkest hour and refined by the sheer power of divine love and sovereignty. The fear had given way to an enduring, sober trust, showcasing how their relationship with God had been profoundly strengthened by the trial. Part 7. The Legacy. The incident on the Sea of Galilee did not merely provide temporary relief. It instituted a permanent internal transformation, a profound shift in perspective that formed the core of their future teaching. They understood that the physical calming of the sea was a powerful metaphor for the ultimate peace that Jesus offered to the human heart, a peace secured through reconciliation with God. The final test, the resurrection moment in their ongoing spiritual journey, occurred every time they faced a new challenge, personal danger, persecution, or the crippling weight of future anxiety. They learned to apply the lesson. The same authority that commanded the gale also commanded the internal turbulence of hate, guilt, and fear. The peace offered was not a fragile emotion dependent on circumstance, but a constant, unshakable reality rooted in Christ's total authority over every aspect of existence, physical and spiritual. The disciples returned to the world, bringing with them the return with the elixir, the invaluable gift of this experience. Their testimony, built on the memory of the terrifying storm and the sudden, absolute silence, became the living proof that the heart that surrenders its control finds true rest. They could now teach with authority that anxiety was the noise of the soul fighting against God's sovereignty, and that the only true antidote was deep, profound trust in the one who commands all things. Their legacy became the understanding that the most devastating storms are often the ones we carry within. For all who seek peace, who feel the frantic pace of the mind and the relentless weight of internal accusation, this narrative stands as a timeless message. The presence of the divine offers a sanctuary that transcends all external threat. Surrender the striving, lay down the ambition and the guilt, and allow the Lord of creation to speak his absolute authority into the chaos of the soul. Peace. Be still. The deepest rest is found only in the knowledge that all is governed by his sovereign, loving care. The itinerary of ministry, while inherently rewarding, carried an immense psychological load that threatened to erode the spiritual tranquility recently acquired. The disciples found that navigating the crowded bazaars and the endless stream of supplicants presented a wholly different class of challenge than the tempestuous waters. This daily friction generated a corrosive kind of anxiety, not the acute terror of imminent physical collapse, but the slow, attritional stress born of continuous engagement and expectation. They were constantly under the microscope of public and critical assessment, a pressure cooker that fueled a perpetual sense of inadequacy and urgency. Simon, in particular, wrestled with the overwhelming sense of responsibility tied to his elevated standing among the 12. The fear of external judgment, the subtle whisper that he might err in doctrine or fumble a demonstration of healing, replaced the memory of the deep's engulfing waters. Now, the tempest resided in his cognitive field, a flurry of what-ifs and potential future embarrassments. He recognized, with a growing sense of sobriety, that true spiritual mastery was not demonstrated in crisis management, but in maintaining an unshakable poise during the monotony of repeated tasks. This required a deliberate, minute-by-minute choosing of inner quietude over reactive thought patterns. This persistent self-regulation was the subsequent phase of their tutelage. They understood that the mind, left unchecked, acts like a busy, dusty thoroughfare where every passing thought, every rumor, and every perceived slight is allowed immediate, unfiltered access. To intercept this cognitive deluge, to achieve the same stillness granted by divine fiat, required an intentional discipline. Consequently, the exercise became learning to recognize the onset of internal clamor the instant it arose, arresting the trajectory of worry before it became a cascading emotional crisis. They learned to treat these intrusive thoughts not as urgent commands demanding immediate action, but merely as transient noises in the distant periphery. Another crucial layer of their developing faith involved managing the corrosive element of comparison. Surrounded by fellow laborers, each gifted uniquely, the temptation arose to measure personal effectiveness against another's visible success. This quiet envy, this yearning for recognition in the ministerial hierarchy, proved a far more subtle adversary than the explicit desire for position they harbored earlier. Such comparisons acted as spiritual irritants, introducing discord and subtly fracturing the solidarity they desperately needed. The peace they had gained could be instantly shattered by merely listening to the internal debate over who spoke more eloquently or who drew the larger, more receptive crowd. The Master's constant, accessible demeanor, characterized by an unhurried grace even when besieged by need, offered the practical paradigm. Observe how he received the most persistent demands without displaying visible annoyance or haste. Now, consider how this applies when you face a deadline or feel utterly overwhelmed by social obligation. The true essence of his instruction, they slowly grasped, was that the source of tranquility was independent of one's output or success. It derived solely from alignment with the eternal present moment, completely divorced from performance outcomes or the scrutiny of onlookers. The objective was not to eliminate challenges, but to sever the emotional entanglement with them, allowing the soul to remain a quiet, sealed chamber amidst the roaring marketplace of worldly concerns. This profound, quiet resignation became the distinguishing mark of their advanced understanding. The experience of divine command over chaos instilled in the disciples a new, profound reverence, but the true refinement of their spiritual maturity centered on the infinitely harder task of managing internal friction among themselves. It was simple enough to acknowledge God's sovereignty when facing a raging external storm. Profoundly more challenging was extending grace when a simple, human disagreement threatened to shatter the harmony of their fragile fellowship. They realized that resentment, the voluntary holding of a slight, the cultivation of slow-burning anger, was simply self-manufactured internal turbulence, a conscious decision to relight the tempest within. The measure of the calm they received was not the absence of external annoyances, but the speed of their willingness to forgive and to prevent perceived offenses from festering into corrosive, internal narratives of martyrdom or justification. For instance, when Zebedee's sons exhibited residual flashes of their former possessiveness over the master's attention, the other disciples had to consciously silence the immediate urge to retaliate with cutting sarcasm or withdrawal. They learned that the divine tranquility they sought was only maintained by actively refusing to participate in the petty warfare of the ego. Now, consider the insidious way that lingering bitterness can accelerate your own heart rate, proving that resentment is physiologically identical to fear. Crucially, the legacy of the sea crossing illuminated the holistic nature of divine peace. Their anxiety had never been purely psychological. It was a physical malady. Before the miracle, chronic stress had manifested somatically. The shallow, guarded breath, the knotted tension in their shoulders, the inability to find true, restorative sleep. The cessation of the external wind brought immediate relief. Yes, but the deeper, continuous peace offered healing not just for the spiritual malady of doubt, but for the neurological and physical symptoms of stress. They began to understand their own bodies as temples requiring sanctified rest, realizing that true faith demanded tending to the physical exhaustion caused by prolonged worry. This deeper awareness transformed simple rest into an act of spiritual obedience, a trusting deceleration rooted in the conviction that the world would not fall apart merely because they chose stillness. Beyond this immediate interpersonal and physical application, the most enduring aspect of the storm's lesson was its preparation for genuine, external opposition. The sea was indifferent to their fate. It simply acted as nature dictated. Later, however, their ministry would bring them face to face with deliberate malice, the hatred of the Pharisees, the scorn of the established elite, and the ultimate threat of persecution. The disciples recognized that their earlier panic stemmed from a desire for comfort and control. The learned response of surrender, the profound realization that they were safe regardless of the outcome, became their greatest spiritual armor against escalating conflict. Their quiet steadfastness, born of the storm's surrender, became their defining characteristic. They realized that to absorb hatred without reflecting it, to endure injustice without responding with bitterness, was the highest form of wielding the peace bestowed upon them. It was a refusal to let the chaos of others invade their protected internal space. They were no longer merely avoiding spiritual competition. They were actively resisting the temptation to adopt the antagonistic spirit of the world they sought to change. Consequently, their composure in the face of escalating threats offered a silent, potent testimony that the inner life, commanded by the Prince of Peace, could truly function as a deep, unshakable cistern of tranquility, impervious to the highest demands and the deepest betrayals of the world. The disciples soon faced a novel psychological terrain, the silence after the applause. Following a day of particularly potent teaching and healing, where the atmosphere had vibrated with ecstatic admiration, they retreated to a small, enclosed garden. The sudden cessation of external validation created a vacuum, a spiritual low tide. It was during these moments of anticlimax that their deepest, most subtle anxieties surfaced. The fear that the favor they enjoyed was ephemeral, dependent entirely upon the last miracle performed or the last eloquent phrase spoken. This anxiety, unlike the stark terror of the storm, was a sophisticated form of self-sabotage, the pressure to continuously replicate peak spiritual performance. Furthermore, they discovered the burden of anticipated judgment. They knew their teacher's divine perspective pierced the superficiality of their external actions. Consequently, they began to wrestle with the insidious notion of unacceptable thoughts. If James harbored a fleeting critical thought about Matthew's slow understanding, or if Thomas momentarily questioned the logic of a divine directive, the subsequent wave of guilt was immense. This self-inflicted spiritual tyranny arose from misinterpreting Jesus' perfection as a demand for their immediate, flawless perfection. They felt the weight of maintaining an internal state worthy of his constant, holy presence, and the resulting inner strain often eclipsed the stress of practical ministry. Now, consider how often your own anxiety stems not from failure to act, but from the fear of being exposed for your honest, imperfect internal state. Another crucial layer to their spiritual maturation involved confronting the anxiety inherent in scarcity. Despite the miraculous provisions they frequently witnessed, the fishermen's minds were habitually tethered to mortal economics, the finite nature of coin, food, and security. They would often calculate the resources necessary to feed the crowds, their thoughts betraying a deeply ingrained lack of trust in supernatural abundance. This pragmatic worry about material depletion acted as a constant, low-frequency irritant, demonstrating that even proximity to the divine did not automatically eradicate deeply held, worldly paradigms. Building on this, however, they began to consciously observe how Jesus operated. He never hoarded. He never stressed the bottom line. His focus was always on the immediate need, trusting the Father for the next hour's provision. This observation served as a silent, profound instruction in radical, material detachment, teaching them that anxiety over the future's provisions was, in essence, a direct insult to the power that multiplied loaves. Conversely, they identified a unique anxiety connected to prophecy, the uncertainty of their own fate within the larger divine plan. They received cryptic warnings of persecution, of separation, and of suffering, yet lacked the full context of the crucifixion and resurrection. The dread of unknown, inevitable suffering created a distinct form of existential anxiety. This was not the fear of a sudden storm, but the prolonged, dull ache of foreknowledge concerning an inescapable, painful destiny. They could calm the sea, but they could not command the future to reveal its precise threats. Therefore, their ongoing lesson shifted from mastering immediate crisis to cultivating a robust spiritual fortitude capable of enduring prolonged, unavoidable uncertainty. The final element of their learning in this phase centered on transcending cultural expectation. Their upbringing had conditioned them to believe that divine favor brought immediate earthly glory and political triumph. The messianic hope, deeply embedded in their psyche, promised dominance and tangible status. When the teacher deliberately sidestepped opportunities for political elevation, the disciples were gripped by an anxiety rooted in cognitive dissonance, a collision between their deeply cherished hopes and the reality of humble, subversive spirituality. They feared that their allegiance to this unique, unassuming king might ultimately lead not to power, but to public ridicule and failure. They realized that accepting divine peace meant surrendering the cultural script of success, embracing an entirely different metric of significance, one measured not by visible thrones, but by invisible, internal obedience. This conscious renunciation of worldly ambition proved to be the price of authentic spiritual quietude. The journeys of the subsequent weeks led the cohort into increasingly hostile territory, where the skepticism was not merely academic but hardened into outright spiritual antagonism. Facing these recalcitrant villages and the closed, sneering faces of local authorities introduced a distinct, draining form of anxiety, the emotional fatigue resulting from persistent, deliberate rejection. It was profoundly unsettling to witness the master's undeniable power met not with conversion, but with calculated contempt. This confrontation forced the disciples to internalize the reality that their mission guaranteed neither immediate acceptance nor personal comfort. The ensuing anxiety was the low hum of spiritual battle fatigue, the exhaustion of constantly facing a wall of human resistance that seemed impenetrable even to divine light. They struggled to keep this external hatred from contaminating their own spirits, realizing that responding to venom with anything less than grace meant conceding their hard-won internal peace. Furthermore, the weight of their growing authority brought with it a tremendous, vicarious burden. Day after day, they absorbed the raw, untreated pain of the masses, the despair of the barren, the horror of the leprous, the silent grief of the bereaved. Unlike the Master, whose reserve seemed infinite, the disciples felt acutely the limits of their own compassion. They worried incessantly about the vast gulf between the sheer scope of human suffering and their finite capacity to alleviate it. Consequently, they began to experience a corrosive compassion fatigue, a deep psychic exhaustion caused by perpetually witnessing agony they could not cure or hopes they failed to fulfill. They needed to learn a sophisticated form of emotional self-governance, how to minister with fierce empathy while refusing to carry the ultimate, crushing weight of outcomes that rested solely in the hands of the Father. Consider, now, the emotional cost of serving relentlessly when your own spirit feels threadbare, that profound need to step back without succumbing to the guilt of self-preservation. Another crucial facet of their evolving anxiety was the intellectual friction generated by the parables. The Master's teaching was profoundly simple, yet often veiled in layers of metaphor that eluded their immediate comprehension. They feared misinterpreting the sacred directives, of simplifying the profound truth into mere platitudes, or, worse, confusing the populace with inaccurate doctrine. This anxiety of custodianship, the persistent fear of being inadequate stewards of the divine message, created an intellectual strain far heavier than the toil of net casting. They were constantly analyzing their own understanding, perpetually second-guessing their capacity to convey the heart of the kingdom. This tension demanded an unprecedented humility, requiring them to acknowledge their intellectual inadequacy and rely on the Spirit for illumination rather than their own powers of deduction. Compounding this intellectual pressure was the simple, inescapable reality of perpetual exposure. The disciples realized that their lives, since the calling, were no longer their own. They sought brief periods of restorative seclusion, a quiet hour on a hillside, a private retreat to a distant village, but the demands of the crowd were relentless, like a rising tide against a low barrier. The impossibility of complete withdrawal became a distinct source of deep, grinding psychological strain. This challenge forced a radical shift in their understanding of tranquility. True stillness could not depend on physical geography or the absence of people. It had to be a forged internal sanctuary, portable and inviolate, a place within the soul that remained utterly sealed even as the outside clamored. They had to learn to build their inner citadel of calm directly amidst the noise, making their peace non-negotiable regardless of the surrounding pressure. The ultimate refinement, therefore, centered on transcending the fear of failing the public test of discipleship. As the mission expanded, the men were keenly aware that they were the living, breathing representation of the teacher's legitimacy. Should one of them demonstrate weakness, lose their temper publicly, or lapse into doubt, they risked discrediting the entire movement. This pressure to maintain a performative perfection created a relentless internal stress, the anxiety of the actor who must never drop his mask. They discovered, however, that the only sustainable defense against this debilitating demand was the courageous embrace of authenticity. By deliberately letting go of the necessity of appearing flawless, by accepting that their true strength lay not in their performance, but in the grace that covered their inevitable failings, they found a deeper, more resilient layer of internal repose. This profound surrender of their need for public validation became the unexpected, silent reward of their arduous journey. The terrifying immediacy of the miracle eventually receded, yet the quiet, stabilizing conviction it forged became the new, unshakable foundation of their faith. They slowly ceased viewing the sea crossing as merely a shocking anecdote and, instead, integrated it as the foundational axiom of their existence. The fear of immediate disaster was fundamentally displaced by the solemn, profound understanding that their ultimate security rested not in a singular, dramatic event, but in the immutable, enduring identity of the one who commanded the event. If the very elements of creation were constrained by his spoken will, then their personal narratives, however complicated or threatened, were safely bound within his loving, omnipotent decree. This cognitive realignment fundamentally altered their reliance on personal foresight and strategy. The former urgency derived from the need to preempt disaster gradually dissipated, replaced by an almost automatic, serene deference to the master's wisdom, even in mundane matters concerning the path to the next village or the allocation of scant resources. Consequently, the anxious, relentless computation of risks that once plagued their thoughts evaporated. They understood that the most faithful response to uncertainty was not frantic planning, but absolute presence in the current moment, entirely trusting the divine pilot to manage the horizon. This solidified tranquility subtly revolutionized their dealings with those outside their inner circle. As they continued their itinerant ministry, they inevitably encountered entrenched skeptics, individuals who relentlessly attempted to challenge the authenticity of the miracles or undermine the validity of their testimony. Where previously the disciples might have reacted defensively, allowing these small, insidious social tempests to disrupt their internal equilibrium, their new calibration allowed them to simply absorb the friction. They processed external criticism not as a personal threat requiring immediate, argumentative refutation, but as symptomatic noise emanating from souls yet untouched by the divine principle of order. They practiced a radical, silent forbearance, extending a compassionate patience that resolutely refused to permit the anxiety or hostility of others to contaminate their own hard-won repose. Moreover, the physical signature of their inner transformation became strikingly evident in their very carriage. No longer did they walk with the hurried, goal-obsessed stride of men perpetually fighting against the clock or against an underlying sense of panic. Their movements became measured, deliberate, and deeply grounded, reflecting an internal cessation of the ingrained flight or fight response. The chronic tension previously housed in their jaws and shoulders, the physical markers of prolonged, chronic anxiety, began to soften and release. They discovered the profound, practical utility of conscious breath, realizing that the pace of their respiration served as a powerful, immediate indicator of their internal state. Now, consider the quiet power of a body that moves without haste. This unhurried, peaceful grace became their most compelling, nonverbal sermon, conveying a message of security that transcended spoken word. The most significant liberation, however, was their emancipation from the tyranny of anticipation. The miraculous cessation of the storm had vividly demonstrated the irrelevance of human scheduling compared to divine timing. Therefore, the anxiety over future contingencies, the gnawing, what if concerning tomorrow's inevitable opposition or next month's material provisions, lost its debilitating hold. They adopted a profound spiritual presentism, choosing to focus their finite energy exclusively on the spiritual and physical demands of the current hour. This discipline freed them from the exhaustive mental labor of attempting to project and control distant outcomes. This profound, deliberate surrender of the future to the known, benevolent governance of God was, in essence, the daily, lived practice of the miracle itself, a sustained commitment to trust over calculation. The collective experience, born of sudden peril and immediate, absolute stillness, settled upon the disciples not as a fleeting memory of wonder, but as an internalized axiom governing their reality. They had witnessed the terrifying velocity of chaos arrested by a single utterance, forcing a profound, irreversible shift in the axis of their personal reliance. The fear of external disintegration, the threat of the deep swallowing their fragile lives, had been replaced by a more sober, enduring awe regarding the boundless, immediate authority present in their midst. This recognition stripped away the necessity of their own frantic striving, revealing that the true sanctuary was not a secure location, but a relationship rooted in unshakable dominion. The erosion of reliance on personal foresight and ingrained habit proved to be a far lengthier process than the calming of the waters. The very act of ministry, with its ceaseless demands for emotional labor and continuous performance, became the crucible where this newfound peace was tested. They found that the anxieties of the mind, the constant recalculation of potential failures, the corrosive pressure of sustaining spiritual momentum, the insidious comparison with fellow laborers, generated an internal roar far more difficult to silence than the gale. The true essence of the lesson, therefore, distilled down to the realization that the power which governs the macrocosm is equally, intimately concerned with ordering the micro-tempests of the human psyche. This understanding generated a radical, protective humility. When confronted by antagonism or skepticism, they learned to avoid engaging in the futile spiritual warfare of reciprocation. They realized that to carry resentment or to lash out defensively was simply to invite the world's chaos back into the carefully governed chambers of their souls. Their evolving response was one of serene detachment, a quiet refusal to allow the bitterness of others to dictate their own internal climate. The composure they achieved was not born of indifference, but of a fierce, sustained commitment to guarding the perimeter of their inner sanctuary, understanding that their testimony rested less on eloquent defense and more on unassailable, quiet stability. Reflecting on this journey so far, one discerns the slow, arduous process of trading limited human control for infinite divine management. The core struggle shifted from merely surviving a moment to maintaining a posture of total, continuous surrender, allowing the unpredictable future to unfold without the debilitating need to predict or manipulate its course. The reward for this difficult exchange was a form of liberation that transcended mere circumstance. It was the freedom from the tyranny of self-judgment and the exhausting burden of self-justification. They became, by divine decree and human assent, like vessels anchored deep within a harbor, where even though the storms may rage fiercely in the open sea, only the gentle sway of the tide is felt. This cumulative experience prepares the way for the profound, lasting implications of this encounter. The disciples moved beyond the transactional, beyond asking for intervention in moments of crisis, to inhabiting a state of permanent trust. This ultimate spiritual inheritance, forged in water and refined by persistent internal conflict, transforms the very definition of security. It is this durable, internalized reality that becomes the ultimate gift they carry forward, the essence of the peace that surpasses all immediate, worldly understanding, offering a compelling invitation to all those seeking respite from the noise. The true legacy of the Galilean storm was not the miracle itself, but the permanent, architectural shift it necessitated within the souls of the disciples. The external drama of the wind and waves served merely as the chisel, forcing them to confront the profound difference between reliance on human capacity and immersion in divine sovereignty. They realized that their anxiety had been a loud declaration of practical atheism, a fear that asserted, in the midst of the presence of the Almighty, that they were ultimately responsible for their own survival. The absolute silence that followed the divine command was the ultimate refutation of this self-imposed burden. This foundational transformation allowed them to finally unburden themselves of the chronic, internal storms that had plagued their lives. The abrasive guilt of past failures, the corrosive friction of ambition and comparison, and the relentless, exhausting noise of an unquiet mind striving for control. They learned that the same authority that stilled the sea possessed the right and the desire to command tranquility within the most inaccessible chambers of their own consciousness. Peace, they understood, was not an achievement earned through spiritual discipline, but a gift received through profound, courageous surrender. It was the conscious choice to stop fighting the reality of their own limited control and instead rest entirely within the vast, known safety of God's perfect governance. The narrative of the apostles, stretching into the difficult, uncertain future, would ultimately be defined by this unshakable internal poise. When they faced public scorn, imprisonment, or the betrayal of friends, they drew upon the memory of that single, terrifying night. They learned to interpret every emerging anxiety as a fresh, immediate invitation back to that state of deep surrender. Their peace became a deliberate refusal to allow external chaos, be it political persecution or personal affliction, to penetrate the boundaries of their God-governed inner sanctuary. Their lives demonstrated that the freedom from anxiety is not found in controlling the outcomes of life, but in acknowledging the absolute, loving control of the divine over every possible outcome. This, then, is the enduring message left by the men who learned to sail with the Prince of Peace. The clamor you hear, the anxiety that accelerates your heart and fractures your focus, is the noise of your own soul resisting surrender. The solution to an agitated mind is not merely better coping mechanisms or deeper introspection, but the conscious, moment-by-moment choice to yield the tiller of your life to the one whose authority demands immediate, absolute stillness from the deepest waves of fear and guilt. For those who seek genuine respite from the relentless internal pressure of performance and worry, there is profound, radical rest to be found. Lay down the heavy weight of control. Trust that the one who commands the gale is profoundly, intimately concerned with the slightest ripple of distress within your heart. Dare to believe that in his presence, all things, internal and external, are ultimately well.